Welcome to the Heart Rate Variability Podcast. In this podcast, we discuss the exciting science behind HRV and how you can apply it to your own health and the work that you do. Just a note, this podcast does not replace medical advice, and if you're going to apply this to your own life or others, please consult with a medical provider. Thank you and enjoy the show. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I am Matt Bennett. I'm here for our last episode in the Wayback Machine. So this has been a fun series for me, going back and listening to all these older episodes to where my passion really began for heart rate variability, where it grew for heart rate variability, and a passion by the end of this series, as you'll probably notice, turns into a little bit of an obsession, which eventually led me to co-found Optimal HRV and the Optimal HRV app. So this has been a great series for me. We continue our conversation about regulation with this one. So this is a nice episode. A little bit of new material, a little bit of an overview of the entire series. So great way to wrap up, and hope you enjoyed this last episode. We will be back with new episodes coming up next week. Take care. Have a great week. Very cool. Well, Curt, I'll turn it over to you to kind of walk us through this article a little bit. Again, everybody can find it at our website, but kind of walk it through us and some of the main takeaways.
But this is a thick one, huh?
This is a thick one.
I was reading it and getting really curious about the thoughts that you guys have about this article, because there was a lot in there, and some of it was review from what we have read so far. I mean, there was a nice, one thing I really like about these articles is you get a lot of repetition of an understanding of how the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system are related to one another, how that impacts heart rate, and how heart rate starts to have an impact on other areas of functioning. And everyone writes about it a little bit differently. So you get to have a little bit of a different perspective and a little bit of a different information about how that system works and operates. So I appreciate that about all of these articles. And this one is no different. And it goes into some pretty good detail about even the differences between Thayer's model and the Porges model, and the difference between afferent neurons and efferent neurons, like information that's going up from the heart to the brain and information that's going from the brain down to the heart. I mean, both of those pathways are activated. And even one of the points from this article is that there are many more neurons and neuronal activity going from the heart to the brain than from the brain to the heart. So we're getting a lot of information from our bodies that's going to our brain. So some really great kind of reviews of the basic mechanism and basic structures that are going on within our bodies. I think one of the things that was certainly an interesting aspect of this article is the idea that of course, this was done at the HeartMath Institute, which is a research facility, and they do a lot of biofeedback there, and a lot of giving you information about what's happening to your body and in your body, and then that information can sometimes help to facilitate change. And so they had actually used the information about heart rate variability and some of the detailed information about heart rate variability patterns that are associated with positive emotional states and negative emotional states, and use that to develop an intervention. And that intervention is a biofeedback intervention where they had people, in a nutshell, I mean, I'm going to kind of destroy the procedure a little bit, but you're getting information about your physiological state while you're mentally creating a focused task and working to induce some positive emotion, and finding that can alter some of your physiology, and your physiology can then impact how you think and your perceptual experiences. So some really interesting, I think, intervention ideas come out of here. And I think a lot of our readers could pretty easily access a lot of that stuff. Another key point out of this article that I thought was quite interesting, and there's quite a bit more writing about this topic, which is correlating reported emotional states to a specific heart rate variability pattern, to a specific pattern of our physiology. And I think that's a really interesting idea, and they're finding some pretty good concordance rates between a specific pattern of heart rate variability. Specifically, McCready was talking a lot about a sine wave-like pattern, which is a very regulated pattern, being associated with states of calm and states of coherence, or a state of having multiple systems be in alignment and in regulation with one another. That's his idea of coherence. So there's some pretty interesting information that has been published using a lot of wearable technology, and that's getting able to generate some heart rate variability patterns, and then asking people, what did you feel while you were in this state? And there's a lot of alignment between what people report in emotional states that matches up with what our physiology is telling us. So it gives us a little more, I think, a more nuanced information about the idea that information that's gathered from our sensory system gets essentially put together in our spinal cord and goes up to our brainstem, and that starts to impact how our brain functions before it ever gets to our cortex. And our cortex is then trying to put a story to what's going on at lower areas of our brain, and that our physiology then changes how we perceive the external environment and our internal environment. So we start to have different experiences based on how our physiology changes. Some great information, I think, some ideas about that.
Could I ask you? I'd love to get your thought on that particular point, and then I'll let you move on. But one of the things that kind of drew me back to and kind of triggered memories of grad school for me was the whole kind of controversy is not the right word, but debate, I think, whether the relationships between thoughts and feelings, and whether feelings cause thoughts or thoughts cause feelings. And this kind of seemed to speak to that a little bit. I'm not sure if it cleared up the conclusion any, but that's one of the pieces that I thought it seemed to be asking some of the same questions that we were asking as cognitive behavioral therapy started to rise in prominence. And again, it's using different language, but it seems in some ways they're looking for similar answers. Does that make any sense? Thinking that way about some of the conclusions here?
It's almost the chicken or the egg question.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
I mean, I think if reading the article, what I take away from the article is it's neither the chicken or the egg. Like either one can happen that way. They're just interrelated to one another, and they're related to our physiology and our biology, which I think is an important point that it goes back to my training in radical behaviorism, that one of the things that came out of that theoretical model was never that thoughts and feelings don't matter or don't impact behavior, but that they are phenomena in and of themselves that require explanation. And so that's one of the things that leads me into getting really interested in this topic, is it starts to give us some mechanisms to help to understand the fluctuations that we can often experience as human beings in our emotional states and in how we perceive those things, and that they have an impact on how we perceive the external environment, which in turn has a big impact on our behavior. So I like that topic a lot. I think it's a really fascinating one. And I love the ideas of getting some better understanding of the mechanisms that underlie those phenomena. Anything you'd add to that, Jerry? You always have some unique perspectives.
That's a lot, right? To kind of summarize. I think from a developmental perspective, this concept of being really biologically regulated or dysregulated, while the brain is in a rapid state of growth early in life, and how that impacts this discussion we're having. In that when that lower part of the brain is receiving coherent information from the body and is able to in some ways be regulated by the relational experiences that are going on between the caregiver and themselves, it helps to organize those lower parts of the brain so that the higher parts of the brain can begin to become organized, because that information is not only used for sensing and organizing, but it's also used as signals of how the brain's going to prioritize the development of higher, whatever, whether I need to live in a highly stressed environment that things can happen rapidly, or whether I live in an environment where I could prioritize reflection and be able to kind of think about the past and my future. So, we have to understand that these biological signals are being associated not only with what's happening in the moment, but what happened in the past and what we imagine could happen in the future. To kind of looking at that. And so, it's a very different for somebody who has a dysregulated state, who has had a history, just like I said, for these kids who grew up in a nice, organized home, for them not to have a job, for them not to do it, they don't feel a sense of distress over that. But if you're living on the street and you couldn't find something to eat and you couldn't find food, it's a very different experience. So I think that when we don't understand these types of biomarkers in a developmental perspective and within the individual history of the individual we're working with, we miss something. And that sometimes when we look at large populations of taking things out of there, it's important for us to take that information and kind of look back and use it to kind of guide us in interacting with an individual. But the individual is going to put meaning to these experiences. And I think that that's the important piece in terms of, you thought, does a feeling drive a behavior? Well, probably in a very primitive animal, the answer to that would be yes, right? But as we move up and we're able not only to respond to what's happening in the moment, but our simulation of what we want to happen and our memory of what did happen, it colors how we interpret that experience. So I think those simple answers that might be in certain lower species answered in one way would look very different in a complex organism as we are, and that we're interrelated. As we kind of see, our heart rate variability has a lot to do with the social environment that we're in, and the context that we're in. So I think, going back to what I said last week, this is really complex stuff. And when you look at one component, it makes sense from that perspective, but we're integrating it into a human being whose brain and physiology is very unique to them based on their life experience.
It makes you think about the concept of, we know a lot, and there's a lot that we don't know still. We're a really adaptable organism. And that means that we have to have a lot of complexity, and that developing that kind of flexibility requires really complex systems to be able to respond to an environment and be able to function in even two environments you were just talking about, Jerry. Like, human beings can function effectively in an environment where there's constant danger around, and we can also function in an environment where being reflective and pausing and thinking in the future is important for survival as well. To be able to have that much flexibility requires a really complicated system. And it's pretty amazing that we are designed that way, and that we've evolved that way to be able to function in both of those kinds of environments. That not many species can do that.
Right. I think it's, I think what the takeaway is how important it is for us as providers to be in a regulated, coherent state, that we could be open and curious to the person's experience that we're interacting with, right? And that it's within that open and curious stance that we have the highest possibility and probability of creating a space where that individual can in some ways come in to coherence with us, right? That we can in some ways help them get into a state where they can maybe reflect, and they maybe can be able to do it, but a lot has to do with what we bring to that interaction to increase the probabilities. And oftentimes when we get dysregulated, we tend to blame our clients for that, right? And I think a lot of the literature we're reading is about what can we do, and Matt, going back to looking at his own biomarkers, what can we do to bring our best self to these interactions to give the highest probability for success for that other person to experience something different.
Mm-hmm. And not only can we impact another person's perception of us in that kind of situation, but that we can also impact their physiology by doing that. It just kind of expands all of the different points of contact and kind of points of influence.
Exactly. So, Matt said, did we know that before? Is this research just telling us stuff we knew before? And the answer is yes, but we're knowing it at a deeper level. And if you think back to your series that you're watching, is that it isn't that these paradigms, that something new got created in the universe. It was a way of looking at them that shifted, that allowed for new questions and then new innovative answers to those questions. Mm-hmm. So I think adding this perspective is not necessarily going to say it's going to give you a new way of thinking. It's just going to add on and make it more, in some ways more comprehensive.
Yeah, it doesn't replace what you already know. Right. It adds to it.
Well, and the other thing I think this article goes into great detail about it too. There's also, with that additional knowledge, there's the opportunity, at least, and again, technology. Even if you look at HeartMath, who wrote this article, their whole measurement system's a big thing you kind of put on your earlobe, and not something you're going to run with or anything like that by any stretch. But you also, I think it opens up different. Bringing in, and I think the three of us have been big advocates for this. As soon as I met an occupational therapist, my whole perception of what I need to do for a lot of my clients changed dramatically. But it also brings in, I think, opens up different interventions as well, which I think is a really exciting thing about this. Is it might be stretching with some deep breathing. We were starting. I'm also reading a lot on Tai Chi and Qigong, and it's like, boy, I'm reading this Qigong book. It's like that's what we're talking about in some ways. This 4,000 year ago literature is talking about controlling breath while doing a lot of the same movements that you see a lot of these folks on this cutting edge of heart rate variability. Some of the stretches that they suggest you do is right in line with this kind of ancient knowledge. I think, again, the cool thing about this is we can eventually get the state that the individual's in and then match the intervention in a different way that might add a little bit more data than just a subjective report that somebody might have from, kind of their baseline. So that's the other exciting thing about this is I think not only is the knowledge deepening, but we're bringing in other fields together around potential solutions to help people regulate and hopefully be a part of their healing process as well.
When you were talking, it reminded me a couple of episodes maybe ago. I talked about when I was at the residential treatment center and started to bring in these alternative strategies for the youth. And actually for the staff to engage in, for art, for yoga, for movement, for music, for recreational kinds of process. And what we found was it's not just that these activities were good for the physical and psychological well-being, but it created the condition that allowed them then to engage in a social interaction and benefit from that. Mm-hmm. Right? And so what we read about some of the heart rate variability earlier about you can have a lot of people and resources around you, but not being open and able to access them. So when we add these other components, it doesn't necessarily take away we're social creatures. We need, in some ways, to heal and recover within the context of social relationships. But because of the because of the stress, the distress, and the traumatic memories that we've experienced, it interferes with us being able to benefit from that. Mm-hmm. And so some of these alternative strategies create the kind of state that an individual needs to be able to, in some ways, benefit from being part of the group that your dog became part of the group with, right? That allows you then to have different experiences and have healthy interactions with others because you're in a space for that. So I think, what we're learning is not only what treatments are good for certain types of disorders, but also what experiences do you need to be exposed to with the repetitions to make use of those therapeutic interventions.
And I love Matt's point about that this kind of information. One of the real promising aspects of biomarkers is being able to individualize those things in an incredibly meaningful way. I mean, as you're describing and setting up an environment where somebody can become a part of a social group means that safety has been established. And otherwise, you wouldn't be a part of that social group. That's one of the reasons why we don't become a part of them. But safety is perceived. So being able to tailor an environment that is safe to an individual who may have a different perception of safety than what I may have as an intervention agent is really important information to get. That may be that, like me saying, we're going to play kickball. Why don't you think that's safe? That's perfectly safe. But it may not be to someone who has experienced a different experience than I have. And I can get their physiology can help me to make that decision better and determine what is a safe environment for that person.
And safety is different than compliance, right? Is lots of our systems want the people who are coming into them to be compliant. As an indication. And that compliance is oftentimes a sense of loss of power and control and a defensive strategy, as opposed to feeling safe and engaging.
Mm-hmm. So one measure of being safe could be challenging authority, right? The exploration.
Was it my house?
That's you challenging your wife? Is that how that goes?
That's how you reframe that when
I raised very verbal children.
They must be feeling really safe.
So I have one of the questions this is brought up. I think as a trainer is one of the things that I do again because some way the technology's there and this is new stuff is that I think we focus on a lot of times whether I'm training on MI or just talking about trauma-informed best practices. We really sort of default to the first piece of being the relationship, we try to throw mindfulness in there and those things as well. But, from all this research, one of my big takeaways is you're not quite sure what the state of the individual in the waiting room before you meet with them is, or whatever environment you're working in. And so we put this really emphasis, which I think is good in so many ways, on trust, safety, empathy, active listening skills, all these things that are historically the foundation of most interventions. And yet what this research is telling us is that I don't know if and this is kind of my question is, do we think 10% of folks coming into maybe, let's say for trauma treatment aren't ready to verbally engage and socially engage? But, I'm trying to think about, okay, how until the technology gets just a little bit better and we can integrate this in some meaningful way, like where we're kind of talking, there's a group of people who aren't ready to really socially engage. But how should people think about that? Because our skill sets evolved engaging people socially more so than doing regulatory exercises or stretching or other things. And so I just kind of wonder for our listeners is, should our default be, hey, that the vast majority of people we're probably working with are ready to socially engage and get to a level of work, if you think about case management or medical providers, or or should we assume the majority aren't ready for that social engagement? We should definitely structure in different exercises. Could we trust an individual self-report? Because they may say, yeah, I'm ready to go, and they're not really ready to go. I don't know. I'm kind of like sitting here as, do we need to shuffle the deck in some way about our approaches?
So Matt, what thoughts those are the questions that are coming up for you. Do you have any, what's your thoughts on that?
You know, I always think about, you know, the regulate relate piece of it. So my thought is, and this was before this series, was to do a little bit of breathing exercises to help, you know, regulate, get both the helper and the client, patient, student present before you engage socially. I think the question I have is, without a reading, so to speak, I think a lot of people might need a lot more than a minute of deep breathing, kind of short mindfulness practice. And they may need that to be the intervention in some ways before the relational engagement can really be effective. And if you look at people dropping out of care at rates, I was just at an HIV conference in Vegas, you know, it's, you know, we have this high rate that drops out of care. And I'm just kind of wondering if, is that representing, to some extent, I think there's a lot of reasons people drop out of HIV care, is that they're not biologically, psychologically in a place to really engage, yet they need help desperately. So, you know, it makes me go back to regulate, relate, ration, but I'm not sure we're doing enough as across helping professions with the regulate piece. Maybe if we get readings at some point, we'll have better data to craft our interventions in real time. But, you know, I'm just kind of wondering if there's like a 5% group out there where we're sort of missing the boat on, or is it 50%? And I know that's a hard question because depending on the environment you're in, that's going to vary differently. But I just kind of wonder how many people in the waiting room are really ready to engage socially when we attempt to do that, or kids in the classroom. So it's been a big change, not change in my thinking, but a big question that I'll probably struggle with for a couple of years as I dive in this research even more.
I think just asking the question is the right direction to go, right? If you're sitting across the table from somebody, asking yourself, is this person ready to socially engage with me or not? And what experience do I need to provide to help them to get closer to that, is a great intervention. Like even thinking that is a very, very good thing to do. I think some interesting kind of bearing on that question was the last article we read, in that the subject, so we read the article about women who were seeking trauma treatment for PTSD and the challenges that they had developing a working alliance. And those with low heart rate variability had a very difficult time developing a working alliance. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think your question is exactly the right one, and probably just asking it is getting you a significant direction towards being able to socially engage with people.
Yeah.
There's we have a case right now that I'm working on with one of the clinicians who works for me, and she's just doing a bang up job of it. And this is a woman with an intellectual disability who experiences a lot of urges to self-harm and some suicidality. And one of the things that we asked her is we have kind of a de-escalation sequence, right? It's a training method. That doesn't mean that it's perfect, right? It's just a training to train people on how to at least think about de-escalating before you do anything else. And one of the characteristics of it is it has a kind of a 3 option component to it, that when somebody's becoming escalated and you need to interact with them, you can either wait and see what happens next. You can ask them if they need help with something, or you can give them a direction to do something. And so there's 3 options available to you. And so one of the things we did with this woman who was experiencing some pretty high levels of suicidal ideation is to say, when you get in that state where you feel that urge and you want to engage with us socially, because she'll do that, she'll call. And we asked, what's helpful for you? When she's regulated, she can answer this. When she's not, she could not answer it. And what she said is what everybody has tried in the past is that they try to help me right then. And that's not helping. That does not help me. What I need you to do is give me a direction. I need you to tell me, no, you can't do that. I need you to say, no, I need you to go do this. And if you do that, I might argue with you, but it will help me in that moment. And so we could tailor what we needed to do in terms of socially engaging with her in a way that was helpful for her. So just coming in with that question, I think, generated that kind of an intervention where, and the therapist, it was, I mean, her reaction to it was just great. She's like, I feel like I'm being such a jerk because she's in this psychological pain and this emotional pain. And I'm telling her, no, you're not doing that. No, you're not leaving the house. You need to sit down right there. You need to but that's what they had developed as what was really helpful for her in that moment. So Matt, asking your question is the kind of the pathway to getting those kind of tailored interventions with what somebody needs, all around what do you need to socially engage with me, and what do you need to help feel safe, and what will keep you safe.
Yeah.
Anything you'd add, Jerry?
Yeah, I think that after working with young adolescent females, oftentimes their emotions are overwhelming to them. They're not useful in terms of guiding their behavior. They're not useful in giving them information. They're just flooding. And so there's a difference, I think Genet talked about vehement emotions, that these overwhelming emotions are not useful states for people to be in. And there's a difference between somebody having an emotion reaction, that they're feeling things and they're using it. And so in a way, what you're saying is this state that she's in, it's not helpful having her just emote or talking to her, right? So it's like, tell me what to do, which is oftentimes what we used to just say is, here's the things you do when you get in these states. Boom, DBT skills training is, here's what you do when you get into these states, is that talking to them about their emotions only escalates the emotional state that's dysregulating. So right. I think that having that understanding that if you're just a therapist that kind of go with that, let's go with that. You might go someplace you don't really want to be.
Right.
And that would be happening. What would happen is when I worked with a group of females, who have a history of abuse, one's affect state would drive the other affect, and all of a sudden they're off having, crying about things that happened and who did what and what. And really it was about, let's just stop and settle down. Mm-hmm. Once you're all settled, we could talk about what you're feeling and what you're doing, but let's just stop and settle down. Or let's go take a walk and distract you. Or, what are the coping skills? So I think, that's a really good point, is that there's no intervention that's good for everybody, mm-hmm. right? But you do have a set of interventions, protocols for your therapist when they get in that state that helps them say, here's what I could do when I'm dealing with this situation. So that protocol probably is better for the therapist than it was in some ways for the client, to kind of looking at that piece.
Helps to regulate them a little bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And really those kind of regulators or limits essentially on processes, both cognitively and physiologically, is what we're finding is, right, those limits, even the limits that our parasympathetic puts on our sympathetic, is a really good thing. Right. It keeps us from just becoming so sympathetically aroused that our heart rate goes higher than we can handle, and our body just can't go that high. And so having a limit on it is actually really helpful.
Right. And, these states don't, they happen simultaneously all the time. We're not in one state, we stay there. I mean, there are some people who are dominant, they stay in these hyper-aroused states, but most of us are shifting from one state to the other throughout the sessions that you have, or throughout an interaction that you have. I go to a training, and if it's boring, I'm in a very different state than I am if it's engaged. I'm dissociating, and I'm thinking about all the other things I'm supposed to do, right, to kind of looking at that. So there's some health about being able to shift states, right? And then the extremes of that is when they happen, you're so sensitized, you have no control over it, that you kind of look at that. So I think learning about some of this information, even recognizing yourself when you are engaged and when you're disengaged, right? You shifted states. And that's okay. You know, when you go daydreaming, you've shifted states as opposed to when you're engaged in asking questions. You're obviously in a more aroused, alert state to kind of looking at that. So, you know, being more aware of the state that you're in is going to help you when you're with your clients to not only be aware of their states, but what state did I get into that is saying something about this interaction, about what this client needs.
Well, one of the things that, a question I have kind of outstanding, and I love, obviously I'm not sitting on a big grant for research funding at this point in my career, but one of the things that this article and really the series has brought up too, especially when you're talking about motivational interviewing and really how we help people change behaviors, is heart rate variability and the stages of change. Because we know somebody, which is why I'm a big advocate for teaching the clients on stages of change, so you don't have to guess where they're at. You can just have a conversation about it. But I just kind of wonder is we know people might be at action stage one day and then this swing back to contemplation or to relapse. There's all these, we see these in the folks I work with, these really big swings, even from a day-to-day sort of basis. And I think we all can relate to that if we're trying to make a change in our own life, a bad night of sleep, or, somebody's trying to eat healthy and that really nice person brings donuts to the office and you have a bad phone call and all of a sudden you're binging out on donuts. We all kind of fluctuate in there, but I guess a question, I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on this, but I would love to train people, like I encourage folks to go through my MI training to work with the clients to understand the stages of change to gain insight to themselves, but also how heart rate variability impacts positive versus negative kind of momentum along that change journey. Because it would seem that your state, your current stage of change as a flexible dynamic thing is highly dependent on your state. And it would seem like, again, before those change conversations, if somebody's, again, has low heart rate variability, again, might be a cue to do some exercises with that. So that was the other thing that I think at the end of this journey, which is really just the beginning, I think, of all of our journeys in some ways, there's just that thought about how this would impact how we try to help people make those difficult behavioral changes as well, and our change conversations and how to craft those too.
One of the things I thought, Matt, that bore on a question you've asked a few times as we've talked about a lot of these articles is heart rate variability a state or a trait? And we've kind of landed on the answer of both. And I think this article gave a little data about that.
Yeah.
That even there's kind of this concept of the amount of heart rate variability that you have as a more trait measure, and that you can still fluctuate in the actual wave pattern of heart rate variability, regardless of how much you have to start with. Mm-hmm. And so that, I thought, put a little bearing on that question that you've asked quite a bit, is which one is it? Like, which one is it? And it is both. Right. Like, there is both a kind of a resting state or a homeostatic state and kind of an amount of vagal tone or of cardiac tone that we have. And then we can also fluctuate within that. And that I love the ideas of that measure and the pattern of variability being associated with different distinct emotional states. Mm-hmm. And that those can shift, as Jerry was talking about. I mean, they're seeing differences in that pattern when we look at that wave pattern in the right way, that there's a difference in the heart rate variability pattern if you are bored in a training and not paying attention, as opposed to mentally focused on the training and on the topic. We see a difference in our biology and our physiology in those two states. And I think that's just fascinating.
Well, and another, I think, question too is, and I think this came from Jerry at one point, so I should probably give him credit for this, though I probably don't enough, is one of the things, I think we were sitting in a trauma group meeting at one point, and it's like, what's this mom need? Mom was really struggling with her daughter who is in the criminal jail. What's this mom need? And Jerry, it might have been you, somebody in the group though, really. It's like, kind of needs a spa day. The mom needs a freaking spa day. And I'm always like, I think about like, Curt, kind of what you're saying with the state and traits. And one of the other thoughts I had is, what if we sent these folks, and again, we're in Colorado, so we have really easy access to beautiful places. But what if we kind of gave these people a 3-day retreat where they got massage, where they got yoga, and just, I wonder if giving them an experience of regulation in the way that honestly middle class, upper class folks have access to, but people in poverty don't, giving them a regulatory experience in an intense way like that might be overwhelming for some. But again, it's just kind of a thought is, if you experience a good, strong heart rate variability, what impact does that have long term? And if you help that person also get skills to go back to that place, do we start addressing some of those underlying traits that might be not useful in other parts of their life now as they try to make some changes? So that was another question, is like, hey, what would a 3-day strategic retreat of relaxation and regulation do from somebody who has not experienced a good amount of regulation or a healthy amount of it for years, if ever?
I'm going to have to jump off, but in response to you, it's really important to understand what that means for the individual that you're giving it to, right? And so some people don't feel like they deserve that. Mm-hmm. And so that might be something you work towards as opposed to just giving them something, because if it feels incongruent with what they're at, that also could be, you're giving them something that's a resource, but they're not in a space to accept that resource.
Yeah.
So I think that, again, is the takeaway, I think, is there's a lot of literature that talks about the more attuned I am to my own internal state, the higher my capacity for empathy, right? And so when we're talking about all these measures and being aware, really it's about our physiology is not only impacting the person in front we're working with, but it's impacting us. And how do we take time in the session so we have 80% of our attention on our client, but 20% internally watching the states that we're getting in? And I think all of our listeners will become better at providing the kind of interventions they can if they become more attuned to their own internal state, not necessarily just the state of the people we're providing services to. So I've got to run. My garage door broken, so there's a guy here to fix my garage. So I'll see you guys later.
Bye, Jerry.
All right, Jerry. Curt, do you have any kind of ending thoughts on our series?
Raises some great questions that whether or not we should give people retreats or not is like, take that question aside. Like, should we do that or not? I mean, it's kind of to put that question aside, but it brings up some great questions about, I'll give you an example of when I first started working in residential treatment. One of the things that people wanted to put a contingency on that kids had to earn was time with their families, right? And they wanted to use that as a motivator. It was a very effective motivator sometimes it wasn't. I mean, honestly.
Yeah.
Right. But when you really start thinking about that, you start thinking, it's well-intentioned, right? Seriously, nobody's doing this because they're trying to screw up a kid's life.
Right.
Nobody was trying that.
Yeah.
But when you think about what does somebody need in order to recover, or what does somebody need in order to actually function better and move more towards psychosocial well-being, social coherence, physiological coherence, what are the experiences that they need, is a great question to ask. And it's a shift in the question to that, away from what do they deserve?
Yeah.
And I just think that's the question, right? Whether what we should do or what we shouldn't do, fine, right? But oftentimes we're not asking quite the right question, I think. And so just shifting to that question of what does this person need is a real large, large leap towards a trauma-informed approach, and I think a real good humanistic kind of approach of, what do people need in order to move towards better physical, psychological, behavioral, physiological health in all these different areas, I think is the right question.
Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you're interested in more information about HRV, please visit us at optimalhrv.com. Also, if you visit optimalhrv.com, you'll be able to sign up for our email list and download our free ebook, Healing with HRV. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.